On March 15, 2016, a group of experienced British cavers arrived in the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea to explore what locals called the Mouth of Shadows. This massive sinkhole had been known to indigenous tribes for centuries, but no outsider had ever descended into its depths. The team consisted of 6 elite explorers, each hand-picked for their specialized skills in vertical caving and underground survival. Leading the expedition was 52-year-old Marcus Ashworth, a veteran of over 200 cave descents across 5 continents. Joining him were 44-year-old Elena Cosgrove, 38-year-old Daniel Reed, 35-year-old Simon Price, 31-year-old Catherine Webb, and the youngest member, 28-year-old Thomas Harrington. They had spent over 2 years planning this expedition, studying satellite imagery and consulting with geological experts. What they discovered from preliminary surveys was staggering. The sinkhole appeared to descend at least 800 meters straight down before opening into a vast underground network that had never been mapped. But what made this cave particularly dangerous wasn't just its depth. Local villagers warned the team about strange occurrences near the entrance. Animals avoided the area entirely. Birds never flew over the opening, and on certain nights, villagers claimed they could hear sounds rising from deep within the earth, sounds that resembled human screaming. The team dismissed these stories as superstition, a decision they would come to deeply regret. On the morning of the descent, the weather was perfect. Clear skies and minimal wind provided ideal conditions for the initial rappel into the sinkhole. Marcus went first, descending slowly on a rope that had been anchored to massive boulders surrounding the entrance. The first 200 meters were relatively straightforward. The walls of the sinkhole were covered in thick vegetation, and moisture dripped constantly from overhanging rocks. But as Marcus descended past the 300-meter mark, everything changed. The vegetation disappeared entirely, replaced by smooth black rock that seemed to absorb the light from his headlamp rather than reflect it. By the time all 6 cavers had reached the bottom of the initial shaft, they found themselves standing in a chamber so vast that their lights couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. The temperature had dropped dramatically from the humid jungle air above to something that felt almost freezing. Their breath formed thick clouds in front of their faces. But the most unsettling aspect was the silence. At that depth, surrounded by rock on all sides, there should have been complete stillness. Instead, they could hear something, a faint, rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse through the rock itself, almost like a heartbeat. Marcus tried to convince himself it was just underground water movement, or perhaps seismic activity. Papua New Guinea sat on an active tectonic zone, after all. The team pressed forward, documenting everything with cameras and collecting rock samples as they went. Their plan was to establish a base camp in this main chamber and then spend the next 3 days exploring the tunnels that branched off in multiple directions. The first sign of real trouble came on the 2nd day. Catherine and Thomas had been assigned to explore a narrow passage on the eastern side of the main chamber. They had been gone for approximately 4 hours when their radio transmission suddenly cut out mid-sentence. Catherine had been describing an unusual formation on the tunnel walls when her voice simply stopped. No static, no interference, just complete silence. Marcus immediately organized a search party. He took Elena and Daniel with him, while Simon stayed behind to guard the base camp and maintain communication with the surface team. They followed the passage that Catherine and Thomas had taken, squeezing through sections so narrow they had to remove their backpacks and push them ahead. After 2 hours of searching, they found Catherine's helmet lying in the middle of the tunnel. The light was still on, and the camera mounted on top was still recording, but Catherine herself was nowhere to be seen. Daniel picked up the helmet and rewound the footage. What they saw made Elena physically ill. The recording showed Catherine and Thomas walking normally through the passage. Then suddenly, Thomas stopped and pointed at something off camera. His face went completely white with terror. He tried to run back toward the main chamber, but something grabbed him from behind and pulled him into the darkness so quickly that the camera barely captured it. Catherine screamed and turned to run as well, but she tripped and the helmet fell off. The camera continued recording for another 10 minutes, capturing nothing but the empty tunnel floor and the distant sound of Catherine screaming until her voice simply stopped. Marcus made the decision to abort the expedition immediately. Whatever had taken Catherine and Thomas was clearly still down there, and he was not willing to lose anyone else. They retreated to the base camp to collect Simon and their essential gear, but when they arrived, Simon was gone. His equipment was scattered across the camp as if he had left in a tremendous hurry. His rope bag was torn open, and the contents were strewn everywhere. Most disturbingly, there were drag marks in the dirt leading toward a tunnel on the northern side of the chamber, a tunnel they hadn't noticed before. Elena wanted to search for Simon, but Marcus refused. 3 people were already missing, and they had no idea what they were dealing with. Their only priority now was reaching the surface alive. The 3 survivors gathered what rope and supplies they could carry and began the long climb back to the entrance. The ascent that should have taken 6 hours took almost 12, not because of physical difficulty, but because something was following them. They could hear it moving in the darkness just beyond the reach of their lights, heavy footsteps that echoed off the rock walls. Occasionally, they would catch a glimpse of movement in their peripheral vision, but whenever they turned to look directly, there was nothing there. At one point, Daniel swore he saw a pale hand reach out from a crack in the rock, just inches from his face, but when he shined his light on it, the crack was empty. By the time they reached the 200-meter mark, all 3 were on the verge of complete psychological breakdown. Their hands were shaking so badly they could barely grip the climbing rope. Marcus was having difficulty breathing, and Elena had stopped speaking entirely. She just stared into the darkness with wide, unblinking eyes. Daniel was the strongest of the 3, physically at least, so he took the lead on the final stretch of the climb. He was approximately 50 meters from the surface when he heard Elena scream below him. He looked down just in time to see her light disappear into the rock wall, as if something had pulled her straight through solid stone. Marcus, who was climbing just below Daniel, began scrambling upward in pure panic. He was moving too fast, not checking his anchors properly, and his rope began to tangle. Daniel tried to help him, reaching down to untangle the rope, when Marcus suddenly went completely still. His face was illuminated by Daniel's headlamp, and his eyes were fixed on something behind Daniel, something above them, on the surface. Daniel turned slowly to look. There, silhouetted against the gray sky at the edge of the sinkhole, stood 5 figures. They were motionless, watching. At first, Daniel thought it was the surface support team, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized these figures were wrong somehow. Their proportions were slightly off, their arms hung too low, and their skin, what he could see of it, was the same dead white as the pale hand he had glimpsed earlier. Marcus began whimpering and then started climbing downward, back into the cave. Daniel screamed at him to stop, but Marcus wasn't listening anymore. He descended into the darkness, choosing the known horror below over whatever stood waiting above. Daniel never saw him again. Left with no other choice, Daniel continued his climb. As he got closer to the surface, the figures retreated from the edge and disappeared from view. When he finally pulled himself over the lip of the sinkhole and collapsed onto the jungle floor, there was no one there. No surface team, no equipment, no vehicles. Everything was gone, as if the expedition had never existed at all. Daniel spent the next 3 days walking through the jungle until he reached a small village. The locals found him collapsed on the trail, severely dehydrated and barely conscious. He was evacuated to a hospital in Port Moresby, where he spent the next 2 weeks recovering. When authorities finally launched a search for the missing team members, they found the vehicles exactly where they had been parked. All the equipment was still there, but there was no trace of the surface team, no trace of the 5 cavers who had descended into the mouth of shadows. The sinkhole entrance had been covered by a landslide, and the local villagers refused to help clear it. To this day, the mouth of shadows remains sealed. Daniel Ashworth returned to England and never went caving again. He refuses to discuss what happened in Papua New Guinea. The only statement he ever made to investigators were 4 words that have haunted everyone who has read the case file. They are still watching.